Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Just a quick note before we start. Hopefully today there will be sort of a new segment starting for BBOR. Well, there'll be the traditional daily upload, but there will also be a shorter upload that's going to come out, kind of like sort of bonus mini uploads, if you want to call them that. And it'll be hopefully about 10 minutes long coming up later today. Now, back to the case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, which is our sort of subject for the hour. What I would say about this one is I finally got around to completing the series The Act. On yesterday's upload, I mentioned that I was about halfway through. Turned out to be 8 episodes. And I had a very big statement to say about the case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard. And if you haven't seen the show The Act, it's fine. You can keep listening. Won't give away any sort of spoilers. And if you are somewhat familiar at all with the case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, I highly recommend watching that in dramatic form. As well as, I would also say, though, if you're just an absolute newcomer to the case, I would really recommend spending a lot of time with the non-fiction materials and the sort of documentaries and just the commentaries about Gypsy Rose Blanchard and the murder of Dee Dee Blanchard back in 2015 prior to watching the show The Act, because they did include a lot of kind of fictitious dramatizations, if you will. But and once again, this is of course geared toward people who are somewhat familiar with the case, so we can just have a discussion. I would say the first thing that I said yesterday was I was very impressed with how the show The Act really carried on with making Gypsy Rose Blanchard sort of the victim of abuse. They highlighted a very overlooked detail, is that this is a woman who endured nearly 20 years of physical, emotional, and psychological abuse at the hands of her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard, and that, of course, led to her murder. But it's like, Dee Dee Blanchard, had Munchausen by proxy, and it was making Gypsy Rose Blanchard the target of an enormous amount of physical pain, putting her daughter through medical ailments that didn't actually exist, forcing her to shave her head, get a feeding tube that she did not need, go through countless surgeries that she did not need, the removal of her salivary glands, all of these things that were just done so that Dee Dee Blanchard could use Gypsy Rose as a cash cow. And I think the first half of the series really highlighted the victimhood of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, and that's something that's really been overlooked by a lot of the media surrounding this case, because they really want to zone in on the fact that Gypsy Rose Blanchard and her boyfriend, Nick Godejohn, committed the murder of Dee Dee Blanchard. And on the previous upload, I stated that Nick Godejohn was charged with first-degree murder for the stabbing of Dee Dee Blanchard, and Gypsy Rose Blanchard was charged with murder conspiracy, but it was actually second-degree murder. She pled guilty to second-degree murder, and that's why she was given 10 years in prison, and he was given life without the possibility of parole. So it's like, I'd say, though, that if the first half of the show, The Act, is really going to be something that is going to highlight the victimhood of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, the second half, like the second 4 episodes of the series, really got into the sort of wrongdoings of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, her own maliciousness, and that is why this case is just so... It's difficult to comprehend on an emotional level. Of course, we can comprehend it on a factual, fact-by-fact replay level, but you don't really know what to feel about the murder of Dee Dee Blanchard and the kind of conspiracy that was created by Gypsy Rose. Because it's like, you definitely see sort of a reversal, someone who is becoming a manipulator. And when you're dealing with the case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, you have someone who, perhaps after decades of psychological and physical abuse that we said, she became somewhat of a destructive individual herself, and that is something that cannot be forgotten. But at the same time, though, it doesn't necessarily excuse the manipulations that she put on people like Nick Godejohn to kind of coerce him and coax him into the murder of Dee Dee Blanchard. Once again, though, I mean, a lot of people believe that Gypsy Rose was just purely a manipulator, that there was never, ever a genuine connection between her and Nick Godejohn. He was just somebody who was kind of like, he fit the bill. He was cast in the part. It's like she got on a Christian dating site looking for guys, but she wasn't even really looking for any sort of any sort of actual relationship. She just wanted someone to free her from the kind of cycle of abuse that she was in, even if that meant murdering her mother. And Nick Godejohn just was the most likely person to do so, because he was a highly gullible individual. He was suffering from autism spectrum disorder, still is dealing with it now. One of the things that I would say is, based on the nature of this crime, it might be kind of an outrageous statement on my part, but I would say that it is almost excessive that Nick Godejohn was given life in prison without the possibility of parole, when, although he definitely should have been convicted of murder, but we've seen other convicted murderers get far less in prison. I mean, we just had the case of Amber Geiger, whatever her name was, from Texas, the woman who murdered Botham Jean. She was given 10 years in prison for murder. And it's like, I don't think Nick Godejohn should have been given 10 years, but 20, 25, 30 years or something. I think that something like that would be somewhat more appropriate, based on the fact that, once again, he did have autism spectrum disorder, he didn't have the highest level of cognitive function, and he was obviously manipulated into this by someone. And sometimes in our legal system, we do have the ability to look at things on a case-by-case basis. And this is a case of very extreme circumstances. And the bold statement that I made yesterday was that even if Gypsy Rose Blanchard had murdered her mother without Nick Godejohn in the picture at all, without him at all, nothing to do with him, she might have been given the same sentence. She might have been given the same 10-year sentence because of the passion-provoked and circumstances surrounding this. I'm not a lawyer, I can't say that 100%, but when you look at other very similar cases about someone going after their abuser, sometimes the charges are lower and sometimes they're the same. And, what was the name of that woman who, she got life in prison for murdering her abuser, but they just commuted her sentence? Her name's escaped me. I'll try and look that up for a future episode. But these things do happen from time to time. Some of the things, though, that I would say that the kind of like the conclusion and the culmination of the show, The Act, is that you can see that there is a certain sense of darkness associated with the character of Gypsy Rose Blanchard. And I say that both in the fictitious version of her and in the real-life version of Gypsy Rose that we can see from media. And you just sort of see that the first half shows kind of like a sense of innocence, and the second half shows a sense of destruction that has taken over, and that no matter what, no matter which way you want to spin it, she has become the victim of kind of a darker spiral and a darker cycle of events, and she can't get out of it. And it's possible, though, that being in prison is one of the few ways that is actually going to break the cycle of this around. But it's like, I would say, though, in terms of committing a murder, the show The Act goes into a lot of detail about how they planned and committed the murder of D.D. Blanchard by stabbing, and you really see, though, it would only have been a matter of time before they got caught. Like, it would only have been a matter of time before somehow this was traced back to them. The way that they were leaving evidence behind, leaving blood evidence, and the improper disposal of the murder weapon. And, I mean, maybe it's just because we talk about a lot of forensic stuff on this channel, but you can definitely see that they would have been caught because of their inability to destroy forensic material. And this is one of the things that a lot of people deal with in murder situations. I mean, Forensic Files has been talking about this for the last 20 some odd years, where it's like, say for example, in a stabbing, the way that D.D. Blanchard was killed by stab wounds. Well, think about all the blood evidence that is left behind. It's like, when you commit a murder by stabbing, you're taking the evidence with you. And it's like, if you were to commit murder by poisoning or arson, those things leave the evidence at the crime scene. So it's like, which one do you want? Pick your side of darkness. You're either going to get caught by having the evidence on you, or you're going to get caught by it because of something you left behind. Or in the case of O.J. Simpson, it was both. But the thing is, it's like, you just go to see that there was no way that they were going to get away with this. And I think, though, although the show The Act didn't say that outright, they were very clear to kind of highlight those specific details. They didn't say it with language, but you could definitely see the sort of kind of backlash associated with committing a crime. Not to mention the whole sort of Raskolnikov effect from Crime and Punishment, where they've committed this murder. Gypsy Rose Blanchard has committed this murder, but she's still overwhelmed with guilt. And by say I convicted, of course, Nick Godejohn did the stabbing. Gypsy Rose is just in the bathroom. And Nancy Grace even made the statement on the Daily Mail, like the Daily Mail YouTube channel, that she shouldn't even have been charged with murder because she was in the bathroom hiding. And I was like, no, absolutely not. She definitely should be charged with something. Not to mention it was her idea in the first place. But the thing is, though, it's like, you do have to examine the fact that this was a case that was orchestrated and planned by Gypsy Rose Blanchard. I mean, if she hadn't been involved, Nick Godejohn would not have gone to jail. He wouldn't have committed this type of crime. Maybe something else would have gone wrong in his life or something. I mean, people who watch porn in McDonald's for 9 hours at a time are usually not the people who have the strongest sense of moral direction. But when you want to re-examine the concept of the sort of crime and punishment angle that we just mentioned, that, okay, Gypsy Rose Blanchard just thinks that if she gets her mother out of the picture, she will finally be free. But at the same time, she goes through with the murder, and that doesn't happen because she's just consumed with guilt. She's consumed with remorse. And not to mention that, what about fear? I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking about when I'm watching the show The Act and just reviewing a lot of the Gypsy Rose Blanchard material is that a different group of people would have gotten away with this. If Gypsy Rose Blanchard had been teaming up with a different guy, they would have gotten away with it. And some of that is down to resources. I mean, they had very little resources, so they had to flee back to Nick Godejohn's sort of hometown, as opposed to, like, running off to a different part of the world or something like that, leaving the country. Many people actually do get kind of caught up in the murder investigations by Googling places with no extradition treaty. And, I mean, like, but that often comes up in a lot of searches that people are doing, countries that do not extradite back to the U.S. So the thing is, though, by the way, we do need an extradition treaty with Russia so we could prosecute criminals like Semyon Mogilevich, but I digress from that. Some of the things, though, that are just kind of surrounding this case is just, they even put out the Facebook post trying to alert people that Dee Dee Blanchard was murdered, and they're even trying to say Gypsy Rose is gone, but they posted it on her own page through her account, and obviously setting off red flags and searches that people can use to trace it back. It was just a matter of time before they were going to get caught. Like, once again, a very sloppy effect that was created by these two murderers. But at the same time, it's not like they had any experience with it, and that's probably for the best. And it really just goes to show you that if you're going to commit a crime like that, please do not, because you're going to get caught. And it has nothing to do, though, with their sort of education level or anything to do with their sort of upbringing. People who are doctors make the same mistakes. People who are educated and academics, they make the same mistakes when it comes to things like murders. I mean, it has nothing to do with intelligence or education. This has something to do with just sort of wanting to be above the law. And with Gypsy Rose Blanchard, I mean, it's not exactly that her primary ambition was that she wanted to be above the law. She wanted to be free from sort of the kind of wrongdoings of her mother and the evil that her mother had instilled upon her own life. But it's that whole effect of, okay, now she got what she wanted, but at the same time, she couldn't escape the evil that she had created, and mostly thinking about remorse for actions toward her mother. A lot of people have been saying that she really seems to show very little remorse for the actions that she created involving Nick Godejohn, almost in somewhat of an indifferent manner, and is like, as soon as he is kind of sentenced to life in prison, she just like wants nothing to do with him. One of the things, though, with Gypsy Rose Blanchard is she became the subject of Dr. Phil's podcast, and he's kind of doing some deep dive segments into her life. And I would say that would definitely be something that I would like to check out. I would never pay for something like that because Dr. Phil has taken up enough of my life. He doesn't deserve anything in terms of money. And, there are also some things that you just don't really want to pay for because, like I said on this channel very frequently, I don't buy books about politics or religion. If it's at the library, sure. But a lot of that goes for, like, some of these people that are charging for subscriptions. It's like, if they have something that's of valuable content, if I can get it for free, yeah, I'd love to check it out. But if I have to just pay like $8.99 a month or something like that, No gracias. It's just, some people are really just trying to put stuff out there that is only for profit. And when it's in that sort of for-profit mechanism, it distorts the content that they're putting out. They try to make things slightly more outrageous, and even Chris Hansen was accused of this with some of the To Catch a Predator-like material that he created after the traditional To Catch a Predator area. It was just like he's just taking the most outrageous content that they had and just selling it on his website for abnormally high prices. So if I could ever get into some of the stuff Dr. Phil put out about Gypsy Rose Blanchard, I think it would probably be some good insight. And a lot of people just don't even like Dr. Phil, period. But the thing is, though, if he does have some genuine first-hand information about Gypsy Rose Blanchard, I think it's good to hear it because it's a primary source. And that's the stuff that I mentioned in the past about even avoiding interviews with some of these murderers when I'm just like, I want to just kind of read the articles that they have about them online as opposed to listening to the print media sources, as opposed to listening to the video media sources and only reading the things in print. But the conclusion that I kind of came to with that was, the videos out there are primary sources, even though sometimes it's frustrating. I was avoiding them because the murderers are just hogging the spotlight. People like Jodi Arias and stuff, who are just arrogantly just sunbathing in the whole sort of, okay, I'm now famous because I committed this horrible crime. They're gloating about it, and they're just braggadocious about it. But the thing is, though, at the same time, if you really want to learn about the case, because we're trying to learn more, not only about true crime, but also about humanity, sometimes you just got to just sort of be like, all right, I'm going to push through this very annoying person's personality, because maybe there's something there that we can actually learn. And in the case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, absolutely. And I'd say, though, that this case, once again, is one that really kind of crosses a lot of particular boundaries, because you have someone who is most definitely a victim, but especially a victim in a lot of very extreme circumstances that you don't tend to notice in a lot of other cases. By the way, I believe that woman's name that I was trying to remember was Centoya Jackson. Don't quote me on that, though. Her name totally slipped my mind. But I digress from that. We see cases of Munchausen by proxy from time to time, but not necessarily in such an extreme manner that Dee Blanchard would go as far as forging the documents around Gypsy Rose's life, including her birth certificate, social security card, lying to her own daughter about her age, so that she can prolong the setup of just kind of using Gypsy Rose Blanchard as a cash cow. It's an absolutely disgusting thing to do. And it's like, do I feel sorry for Dee Blanchard for being murdered at all? No. Should it have happened? Also no. It doesn't excuse the actions that were committed by Nick Godejohn. Once again, he was wrong. He committed first-degree murder, and he should be going to prison for a very long time. I still, though, stand by that statement that he should not have been given life without the possibility of parole. Maybe 30 years before he's eligible for parole or something like that. Because once again, this case has some very intense circumstances that I don't believe a lot of other kind of murder cases have. And yes, there is this kind of revolving cycle of money, sex, and power that we've talked about on this channel a lot. And that's just a very commonly held belief that people commit crimes because of money, sex, or power. And in this particular case, it is mostly a power dynamic and a power initiative. But the thing is, though, Gypsy Rose Blanchard is really trying to gain power over her own life. She was the victim of abuse, but in doing so, she kind of resorted to certain illegal measures that made things just a lot worse for everyone. She now has to serve 10 years in prison, although she doesn't seem too unhappy about that when you watch her in some of the interviews. And now she's engaged or something. Supposedly, I saw this one headline that she's now taking photos with her fiancé. Maybe that's just kind of her area, the person who is just kind of doing things by correspondence. In the show, The Act, they kind of revealed a few sort of details about her corresponding with an individual named Scott, like via text message, but I think, though, that sort of storyline was heavily changed from the way that happened in real life, about how Gypsy Rose was developing, just a very strong attraction to an individual via correspondence, and for 2 years she was corresponding with Nick Godejohn. I think that's just her area. online dating. She likes to sex, but not to do anything else or something like that. I don't know 100%. And even, once again, even if you could sit some of these people down and actually ask them some of these hard questions, I don't necessarily know that they would be able to give you honest answers. But at the same time, we can definitely see that the show The Act is something that I would recommend to anyone who is curious about Gypsy Rose Blanchard, but I would hope that people would check out some of the kind of hard source material first, so you can really kind of gain an understanding. First, you can kind of see the sort of truth that the story has to offer, and then you can see how it's kind of represented in fiction, and how there's sort of, it lets you just sort of have that kind of more in touch with the details that are missing from the hard evidence that we have from in the nonfiction version. Like I said, first it starts out as this kind of dynamic of someone who is being the victim of some very intense crimes and very intense abuses, but then there's that whole sort of transformation into darkness, and someone who is the kind of becomes the manipulator, becomes the perpetrator, and ultimately orchestrates the murder of her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard. Well, that's all for me now, and thank you to anyone who has listened to this. If you have anything to say at all about the case of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, please drop a comment below, and until next time.